The Battle for Moriah, Chapter 15. During the day, Joab had been successfully lowered over the wall of the castle into the village. Archers stood at the ready in case any of the Mazakim should emerge and attack Joab while he remained vulnerable. There was no sign of them. Suddenly, however, two men ran towards him from the nearby houses. They were soldiers, known to Joab and faithful to the king. The soldiers brought him to where Caleb and Gideon waited. Gideon looked grim. "We've lost many good men last night, but now today we have hunted all day and we cannot seem to find a single one of the creatures. We know they're here, waiting to strike. How wish we had more men." "The guards and the police are needed in the castle," Joab answered. "We are on the front lines now. But this war will not be fought by ordinary battle tactics. This is our village, our kingdom. I, for one, am not willing to retreat into the walls and wait while the world falls down around us. I do not want to be on the defensive. We must turn this thing around." "I agree," Caleb said, "but how? We can't even find the enemy, and yet we suspect that they know where we are. And there are still citizens trapped outside the village in the fields and forests. We do not believe there are many left in the actual village. We found many dead. The men are scared to move because while we are looking for Mazakim, we feel more like the hunted than hunters." "What we must do," Joab said, "is create a territory for ourselves within the village. It should stretch from the wall to the outskirts of the village. In this way, we will create a means by which to transport people to the castle. Have your men build a ladder so that our people can get over the wall. The archers will watch that area and shoot anything that isn't human. However, should the Mazakim attack, we will have to tear down the ladder immediately, even at the cost of our lives. It is imperative that none of these creatures be permitted to get into the castle." And so the plan was put into action. Joab, Caleb, and Gideon each led a contingent of men, Joab up the middle, Caleb and Gideon up each side. They searched every home and building they came to from top to bottom. Once a home was secured, guards would be left, and the remainder of the army would push on. In this way, their territory slowly grew as they took back their village. Each contingent of the army selected men whose job it was to bury the dead. This job took its emotional toll on the men, as in the village many knew each other, at least vaguely. And so men buried their brothers and sisters and friends in the yards of the homes they were found in. In time, however, the men felt strengthened. Death was not so all around them. It would be overcome. By late afternoon, an avenue of land had been reclaimed for the king, stretching all the way to the edge of the village. Here the farmers' fields began, stretching for some distance to the forested hills on each side. All around the perimeter of their territory, soldiers stood with swords to the ready. Other soldiers patrolled the interior of the territory, while yet others took the opportunity for a much-needed rest. Soon word spread outside the village that there was a way into the castle before the enemy army arrived. Entire families came racing across the farmers' fields to the king's territory, as it became known. Women carrying babies, men carrying elders, children running with their heads low and their eyes bright and attentive. They were escorted across the territory like a channel crossing through an ocean of death and destruction. Soon, more than one ladder had to be erected to accommodate all the incoming citizens. Some came along with horror stories of how the Mazakim continued to terrorize the farms outside the village. Here was a man carrying his infant daughter, badly burned. His wife and another daughter were killed when the Mazakim had set his house on fire. As the sun set, the numbers of people coming through the king's territory slowed. 2 of the ladders were taken down and actually disassembled, lest the enemy use them. Only 1 ladder remained. The soldiers guarding the perimeter of the territory began to feel that they were spread too thin. As visibility diminished, torches and lanterns were lit. And yet the archers began to feel that they would be unable to effectively protect the area surrounding the ladder. Caleb, Gideon, and Joab met together to discuss what should be done. "We must reduce our territory," Gideon said. "Of course, it's important to keep an area in which we are safe, but the larger it is, the thinner we are spread. Our enemies are out there, and they will re-emerge in the dark. I do not want to close the avenue that we have opened, Joab said. There are still others out there. We'll put the entire kingdom at risk, especially the men out here, if we let ourselves be defeated, Caleb said. We will reopen the avenue tomorrow, in the day. For now, let's pull our men into a tighter circle. What about the people who use the cover of night to get to us? Joab argued. They would be trapped in the fields all night. Not if we reneged on our part closest to the castle, Gideon pointed out. We'd lose the advantage of the archers, but they can't do much for us anyway at night. Our territory could be positioned near the edge of the village, with the stronger perimeter, but where people could still reach us. We protect them through the night, and in the day we escort them to the king. I hate to give up the territory we worked so hard to gain, Joab said, but I agree. If our perimeter is breached at night, we would be at a considerable disadvantage. Just then they were interrupted by a soldier. Sir, we have movement on the perimeter. The three commanders ran to the section that the soldier had indicated. Like all parts of the village, this area consisted of narrow roadways and cobblestone roads. It was a mostly residential area, away from the square and the shops. The soldiers had been given strict orders not to leave their posts, as any break in the perimeter would be an entry for the Mazakim. But here were the monsters, in numbers and strength that no one had anticipated. Moreover, they functioned more like men than beasts, and it was clear that they were organized. They were not scattered around the perimeter. They came in force on one spot. Organized though the Mazakim were, they looked like animals. Screaming, shrieking, howling, grinning. They came out of the houses and through the side streets and over the roofs. Terrified, the soldiers in this section backed away. Some others from nearby ran to help, but this only weakened the other sections. Every soldier within the king's territory was brought to attention to focus on this area, but those along the perimeter were ordered to maintain their position. There are too many, Gideon said, and it's too late now to reduce our territory. We're not organized. The animals surged forward and fell back as one. Stand your ground, Joab shouted. Whatever you do, do not break ranks. One of the creatures let out a strange laugh and then flew on its leathery wings to a spot on a rooftop, just on the perimeter. Then, to the horror of the soldiers, it spoke. Kill them! Several arrows fired at the creature on the rooftop at once, but it dove onto a nearby soldier. The soldier slashed wildly with his sword, but it was too late. The creature landed on his face. The others surged forward with shrieks and howls. The soldiers backed away. Steady, men, Joab shouted, and ran to the front of his soldiers. He let out a battle cry of his own and ran forward. Emboldened by the courage of their leader, the soldiers followed, swords drawn. Mazakim and men alike fell on the streets, but soon the ranks were thinning. Caleb was behind the men. He mounted a horse and began to ride around the perimeter, ordering the men to tighten in. But when he looked behind him, he saw that the ranks had been broken. The Mazakim were in the perimeter. Flanked by the monsters, the soldiers panicked and ran. But the Mazakim moved more swiftly, and so more men fell. Caleb too raced with the men until he came to the clearing below the castle wall. There was the ladder. It had still not been taken down. Caleb swiftly moved to it and knocked it down before turning his horse around to face what approached. He was trapped against the wall, with some 10 or 12 soldiers with him. And there, stepping out of the shadows, were the Mazakim, 30 or 40 in number. From atop the wall, Reuben watched all this with horror. Fire! Kill them! He yelled. His archers fired at the Mazakim, holding them at bay for a moment. But their leader, the winged one, let out a shriek and came flying out of the shadows at the men against the wall. Again, the others followed its lead. Arrows flew from above, striking both men and the Mazakim. Hold your fire! Reuben yelled. Once more it was hand-to-hand combat in the clearing. The men were vastly outnumbered, cut off from the rest of the army. Soon half of them had fallen, and there were still 30 or more Mazakim battling them. 2 of the Mazakim got the ladder back up, and several were beginning to climb. Caleb turned his horse back into the fray, and with his sword he cut down the Mazakim left and right. But before he could get to the ladder, several Mazakim pounced on him and on his horse, and dismounted him. The archers stood at the ready, waiting for the order, but their own men were in the battle. Finally, Reuben gave the command. Fire! A barrage of arrows came down upon the group, such that none of the Mazakim, or the men, or even the horse survived. Chapter 16. I've been waiting a long time. I thought maybe you wouldn't come, Holofernes said. I wasn't sure if your having been promoted would change our plans, Sarah said tentatively. It doesn't. We'll be married tonight, but secretly. We'll march in with the army, wait for the king to die. Only then will we make known our marriage, and that I am now the rightful heir. Sarah smiled weakly. This had been her own plan. Sort of. But her mind seemed fuzzy. She could not even remember the details herself. Weren't they going to leave and go in through the tunnel? Where did this horse come from? Holofernes asked. Sarah started. I thought that perhaps we could use it to get to the castle. I stole it. Holofernes' eyes narrowed. I don't believe you. I think you intended to escape. Sarah tried hard to think of something clever, but could not. She was clearly caught. However, she knew that Holofernes too was trapped by his own scheming against Ra and the dragons. He could not very well turn her in. Holofernes drew his sword. I could kill you here and now, he said. No one would know it was me. And since you've been reassigned to Shechem, he'd be punished instead of me. Do you value your life? Yes, Sarah answered, her eyes filling with tears. Please, have mercy on me. Then you will marry me, Holofernes said, grabbing her by the nightgown and pulling her close to himself. It will not be binding without a witness, Sarah said. Perhaps in the kingdom that's how it is. That's not how it is out here, Holofernes said. You will give yourself to me here and now, and we will be married. You will be bound to me. This horse can be the witness, and it can be your wedding gift to me. Spare my life and the horse is yours, Sarah said. Rua grunted then and lowered his head, almost as though assenting to the plan. For the first time, Holofernes looked directly at the animal. What a magnificent creature, he said. Too bad you did not have the sense to bring a saddle. This horse is not even furnished with reins. How did you expect to escape on this horse? I've been trained in the palace, Sarah began. I can ride bareback. I'm sure a former general like you can too. Or at least I'm certain that you used to be able to when you were younger. Huh, Holofernes grunted. I may not be so old as you think. Living in the desolation outside the kingdom does not age one gracefully. However, you will soon discover for yourself just how youthful I am. With that, Holofernes leapt gracefully onto the back of Rua, as if to demonstrate his point. However, mounting a horse was one thing. Riding a horse like Rua was quite another. Rua suddenly took off, running full speed between the trees in the forest. Holofernes clung desperately to the horse's mane, yelling, Whoa! Stop! And a number of other things which shall not be recorded here. Branches scraped his face. One nearly knocked him off his horse. It was as though Rua deliberately ran directly under the limbs of the trees. Holofernes lay as low as possible on the horse, his head barely missing one thick limb, his back scraping along it. As he looked back at his near-fatal encounter, Rua suddenly and unexpectedly stopped and reared back, effectively throwing Holofernes off balance such that when the horse next bucked, Holofernes found himself thrown into the air, and he fell onto his back onto the rocky ground. Stunned and winded, Holofernes opened his eyes and tried to focus, as he saw Sarah running to him. Rua had run in a large circle and deposited him nearly at her feet. He felt dizzy, and his thoughts were foggy. He saw her bending over him, tending to him, and he groaned. He felt that he could not move. Suddenly he noticed that she had removed his sword from his sheath. Without a word, Sarah chopped off his head. Tobias sat still in the cave, wrapped tightly, sword in hand. The dragon had not stopped his tirade. Tobias felt himself weakening. At first he was resolved not to even entertain the thoughts that the dragon put into his head, but they seemed, overall, so logical, consistent, and true. More troubling than this was that Tobias grew more and more tired and less prepared to see where things were illogical and inconsistent. Tobias would see a premise, recognize that it was false, but because he had refused to speak with the dragon built argument upon argument, and though the premise had been false, Tobias forgot what it was that was false about it. Eventually, it seemed that the arguments built on the premise followed so logically that they even proved the premise itself. Or did they? But Tobias was too tired to think about that. He heard the dragon's arguments repeated and in different forms, such that in time the mere repetition of the lie seemed to indicate that it was truth. Tobias wished that he had slept more, or had more of the bread or the fruit, or something to sustain him. He felt his hope slowly draining out of him. He had set out on a mission, and now, well, was it even worth fulfilling? He did not want to be presumptuous and prevent Sarah from becoming the woman she wanted to be. He had a duty, by love, to support her in her decisions. The weight of his sword had long since worn on him, and he had allowed its tip to come to the ground. He still held it by the hilt, thinking that should the dragon strike, he could probably wield it on time. But the dragon showed no intention of striking. Instead, the dragon spoke on and on. "Marriage is another example of a patriarchal institution," Molech was saying. "It was created precisely so that the king could maintain power over his subjects. Insofar as the man obeys the king, he can make a claim that his wife is under him. We shall have that abolished. Of course, we'll not do away with marriage altogether. We'll just make it so that it's not binding. If two people want to be married, we will let them. And if they want to be divorced, of course we will allow that as well. Not only allow, but empower. It is not enough to say that people are free. We must create a society in which people are impelled to be free and to maintain their freedom. Free to marry and free to be freed from marriage. Every individual, then, will be independently his own ruler, his own king. That is the kind of kingdom we dragons have envisioned. A free kingdom, without restrictions. One where no one is impelled to suppress their desires. We shall not tolerate anyone in this kingdom who attempts to limit the freedom of others, either preventing it or by not empowering it. This is precisely why we are attacking the king. He has run a dictatorship with no room for discussion or debate. He has systematically created injustices. It is not that we will depose the king exactly. He will be permitted to live, even permitted to call himself king. People like the idea of having kings. It gives them a false sense of security. Though it keeps them naive, we must allow for it. After all, true freedom will include the freedom to choose to call whomever you like king. We will have several kings. In the end, the kings will serve as great motivators to serve for the peace and prosperity of our people, but they will not be permitted to hinder our freedom. Tobias felt his grip on his sword loosening. His hand was on the ground now, his sword merely lying on it. Molech went on. The kingdom will become a utopia. It will be understood that while there are many so-called kings, there's no actual king. People will be permitted to pursue whatever ideology they find best suits and enables them to live out their potential as self-realized individuals. Each person will have their own moral compass, their own rules, and will be permitted to live accordingly, provided they do not inhibit another's freedom. Of course, there will be rules. Rules are necessary to some degree to serve the best interests of the majority, but these will be subject to change as the needs of the majority change. Molech chuckled lightly to himself. This is so obvious, so perfect. If only the king were not so selfish, wanting power, and everything done his own way, he could have spared us the upcoming battle. Fool! Does he not see? I believe he does see it, and he is selfish. He has lied this whole time, saying, you may have this, but you may not have that, as if there were some sort of greater truth. No, he only pretends in order to subject all others to his will. Well, no more. When we arrive, the uprising will be so complete that he will be forced to see his errors and beg for mercy from his own people. In the end, there is no truth, only ideals. Tobias's head drooped. He could barely keep his eyes open. These words of the dragon rolled through him now as if they were his own thoughts. He did not have the power to resist anymore. He had lost the will to resist. After all, it appeared that the dragon was right. It was true that the king felt he and he alone should decide what the moral laws were. It was true that he bound his people to obey these norms. It was true that there was no truth. Tobias blinked. He repeated that last thought in his mind. It was true that there was no truth. He saw suddenly the logical inconsistency in this. Moreover, it underlay all of the dragon's arguments. The dragon claimed he did not believe in truth. But how then could he pretend to reason? Truth is the matter of logic, and logic the form of truth. Without truth, one could not build an argument upon the basis that the premises were true. Everything the dragon had said began to unravel. It was all based on the premise that there is no truth, a premise that is self-refuting. If truth is an illusion, then it naturally follows that logic is an illusion. Therefore, there must logically be truth. To argue against it would be inherently illogical. Tobias grabbed his sword again and felt a new strength, a new clarity. Molech attempted to argue for freedom without truth. But what is the value of that? Behind it lurks a grave danger. A society built upon it would quickly dissolve into disorder, anarchy, completely dominated by self-indulgence. Suddenly, it was all clear to him. Molech was still speaking, still articulating his plans for the kingdom. But they rang empty, hollow. Tobias knew that Molech himself would see the falsehood in it, but would ignore it. Yes, Molech knew that there was truth. He was too smart to fall for the alternative. But he could string his arguments such that he could deceive others. Then Molech stopped speaking and looked intently at the man. Tobias pretended to be asleep, but kept his eyes open just enough to see what was happening. Molech looked around this cave, his leathery ears perked, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air. He looked toward the entrance of the cave, then quickly and quietly moved towards it, hiding himself in the dark towards one side. At the mouth of the cave, morning sunlight poured in. There appeared the silhouette of a soldier on a white horse. The soldier had a light build, wore armor that was much too large, and had long, blonde hair. Tobias suddenly recognized that it was Sarah, mounted on Rua. Molech also recognized this, and was in a position to pounce as soon as she walked into the cave. It was clear that Sarah, for her part, could see neither Tobias nor the dragon in the darkness inside the cave. Sarah got off the horse and stepped into the cave, and at that moment Tobias bolted straight at the dragon. Molech, who'd been watching Sarah, was startled to see the man he'd been lulling into apathy all this time, suddenly armed and prepared to attack. The dragon shrieked in a manner befitting an animal and let out a stream of fire at his charging adversary. Tobias guarded himself with his shield and his mantle, and found that these did indeed prevent the fire from passing through. Sarah still carried the sword stolen from Holofornes, and she too charged Molech, slashing his right leg. Molech pinned the girl under his injured leg and looked at her with hatred. She felt herself being crushed under him. But before the dragon could kill her, Tobias managed to get under the belly of the dragon and pushed his sword straight up into the chest of the dragon, burying it to its hilt. The dragon screamed, flapping its great leathery wings, and reared backwards, in a movement releasing Sarah. All at once, Tobias picked Sarah up off the ground while Molech staggered and fell. And so the great dragon, Molech, died, plunged to the heart by the sword of truth.